Good morning, everyone. This is such a beautiful song that I thought I would start by reading the translation. Yeah, the tune is gorgeous, the words are beautiful, but the meaning is also wonderful. This Tumi Nirmala Koro by Rajanikanta Sen. My heart is tarnished, shine it with your kind hand, make it pure. 1,000 aimless desires in 1,000 dark directions run. Soon they will drag me down into a bottomless sea of poison. My Lord, destroyer of dangers, please confront my drunken desires, tame them, and gather them, transformed at your lotus feet. You are present in fire, in air, in the ever-blue sky, in the mountains, in the ocean, in the forests, in the trees, in the creeping vines, in the clouds, in the stars, in the moon, and in the sun. Blindfolded by my own hands, I cry hopelessly in the dark. I see nothing and I understand nothing. Please give me sight. Help me understand. Very nice. Our topic this morning is each is great in his own place. And I've been noticing in our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class how many times this question comes up, sir, do we have to renounce the world? We're just householders, can we also realize God? The big issue, it runs through all of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, actually runs through Gita, also this whole question of performance of duty, renunciation of duty and everything. And this is a topic that, of course, plays a very important part in Swamiji's understanding of Karma Yoga. The title that we have for the talk, Each is Great in His Own Place, is also the title of one of the lectures that Swamiji gave. When he first came, his first visit to the United States, he delivered a series of 8 lectures which were combined together. And this is what we know as that booklet, Karma Yoga. Swamiji, they've divided his things. Some of them were his lectures, some classes and writings, but we have our 4 yogas, Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. And this probably was the first of all of them. But it's very important because Swamiji's view of Karma Yoga was a little bit different. I remember one of our monks saying that he didn't teach Karma Yoga, that karma is a path, that he taught it as a spiritual way of life, it's a type of worship, that he raised it to a higher level. We have different ways of understanding Karma Yoga. For some, it was preliminary. It's meant to purify the heart. It's meant to get rid of this selfishness and this idea of agency, and then we're fit to practice Jnana Yoga. Swamiji raised it to a higher level where it's not simply a path to God realization, but it's a different vision of the world. And he raised it from a type of practice to worship itself. This is the essence of Swamiji's practical Vedanta, that great teaching he got from Sri Ramakrishna, that we see Shiva dwelling in all beings, and we serve them as a worship of God. Shiva Jnani, Jiva Seva, became a very important part of the work of the Ramakrishna Order also. So this is the second lecture that Swamiji gave in that series on Karma Yoga. Each is great in its own place, and important for several different reasons. One, it stresses this idea that we all have a different role to play in this world, that we have a different set of duties and obligations depending on our situation, depending on our nature, and that it's not good to compare one with the other, that we simply accept the fact that this is where we are at this point in life, and if we fulfill our obligations, we do our duties, and all with the spirit of worship as an offering, however our spiritual attitude is, that we can achieve the very highest goal of life. So each is great in its own place. This, of course, will refer to the householder and the sannyasin. This is the main theme of this lecture that he gave. We'll find that there'll be duty as an individual thing. Each one of us has our own set of things that we do in life. And then universal. There are certain ways of acting in this world that apply to everyone. And we'll see that this will be with non-attachment, this will be with no selfish desire, this will be doing everything as an offering, free from the sense of agency. All of the very well-known aspects of Karma Yoga, these apply to everyone. But when it comes to this idea, renouncing the world, living in the world, having a family, this will be particular. And it will depend upon the nature of the individual and circumstance to a large extent also. This understanding is important also when we read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, because we see so many different types of teachings that sometimes he'll emphasize this idea of renunciation to a great extent. Other times he'll talk about living in the world like a maidservant doing all of her duties and yet not having any attachment to that. And we get confused sometimes. Many people, they'll read these things and think, oh, can we really have the highest realization unless we renounce everything? And this is a confusion that was not just our confusion. Even devotees at that time, sometimes they would hear Sri Ramakrishna speaking about renunciation in very strong terms. And they say, well, what will happen to us? We're householders. And sometimes he would say, this isn't for you. This happened a few times when Narendra was there, especially. He'd be having a conversation with him and talking about how you have to renounce everything if you want to realize God. And then the others would say, whoa, what about us? And he'd say, don't, this is between the two of us. On the other hand, I have this feeling that when he was giving those type of teachings, of course he was aware that others were there, let them at least hear it. Not that they should feel like they're second-class citizens or get depressed, but at least let them hear it also. Because this is another element I want to bring out that we'll get at the end, that Sri Ramakrishna had a view of, and Swamiji also, maybe to a greater extent, of the householder having a bit of the sannyasi in him, and the sannyasi having a bit of the householder from the point of view of performance of duty. And it's really a new vision. Sri Ramakrishna gave us a new vision of the householder who had the heart of the sannyasin, and Swamiji gave us the new vision of the monk who was active in living in the world and performing duty in a sense that wasn't done before in the monastic tradition of India. Generally, the monks in India didn't do any social service work or anything like that. That was a new thing that Swamiji instituted. Even in the Gita, we see this is a very dominant theme that Sri Ramakrishna will talk about performance of duty, and then he'll talk about renunciation, and Arjuna will get confused. And he'll say, tell me, which is better? First you're telling me that to renounce, then you're telling me to perform my obligations, and it's causing great confusion in my mind. Tell me once and for all which is better. And sometimes we get different answers. Sri Krishna tells him that, well, they're both good, but if you really want to pin me down, then Karma Yoga is better. And other times he'll say, well, there are two different paths. In the beginning of creation, the Lord created these two different paths for different types of people. Some will be more attuned to this idea of Karma Yoga, some more to Jnana Yoga or Bhakti Yoga, that it's more a question of that. But emphasis is a little bit more on performance of duty in the Gita. Even when we're talking about renunciation, he says that these obligatory duties should not be given up. Other things that are kamya karmas, they can be given up. So even for the monk, there are certain duties and obligations that we have to perform that put us in the same category as the householder who has duties and obligations to perform also. So we'll see there's a very big distinction between the two, and then there's a way in which they can blend together a little bit. A new vision, really, that Thakur gave for the householder and Swamiji gave for the monk. So Swamiji starts this lecture with a long, involved story about this king in the kingdom who wants to, every time the sannyasin comes, he asks the question, who is greater, the householder or the monk? Some of you will remember in our summer camp that the kids did this. They enacted this whole theme and the whole long story. It was very, very nice with the dance of the birds going into the fire and everything. Yeah. So that's the basis for this lecture that Swamiji gave, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to start out a little bit with this idea about duty, performance of duty dharma, and the ambivalence that we find in the tradition. Ambivalence because we'll find that in Gita, for example, that the dharma is taught as the highest obligation, that we have to perform our duty, and this will not only make us good functioning citizens and playing our part in society and everything, but this can lead to the highest realization, either indirectly through purification of the heart, or even directly. Gita likes this idea. Shankaracharya takes it more as a preliminary thing, that is for purification of the heart, get rid of this idea of ego and self, and then we have the highest type of wisdom. The Gita is a little bit more that we can directly go from the practice of karma yoga and duties to have God realization. At the same time, we see in the Gita that those who have reached a higher stage, to them there's no duty. Tasya karma navidyate, no karya. There's nothing that has to be done at that higher stage. And then, after spending 18 full chapters telling Arjuna, do your duty, he says, sarva dharman prityaja, give up all your dharma. Give up all sense of duty and obligation, and renounce everything, and take refuge in the Lord and me, and don't worry, everything will be fine. So a little bit of this ambivalence, and we wonder a little bit how we're supposed to understand all of these things. Okay, let's start with the actual story. We'll get lots of opportunities to go through all of this, but let me just do one little aside before we start. We were talking this morning about this idea of swabhava. How do we decide what path we should take? In traditional Hindu society, there was this theory of the different stages of life. We know that first one is the student, brahmacharya stage, and then after that, one becomes a householder. And this was obligatory according to many. Later, of course, we know that you can go directly from being a brahmacharya to being a sannyasin. But there were many people who said, no, you have to go through this householder stage of life. And then you can learn all the lessons of life, all the good and bad, the ups and downs, and then you'll be ready to retire. Go into the forest, become a vanaprasthin. And then after that, renounce everything, become a sannyasin. So this was the stage of life theory. And then later, this idea came that no, there'll be some who maybe they did it in a previous lifetime, or for whatever reason, that they don't have to go through this other stage of being the householder and all of that. They can go directly from the brahmacharya to sannyasa. There are all different theories. At one time, it was not that the sannyasa was not accepted, that they were outside the bounds, not considered the fourth ashrama, because there's no place in society for the sannyasin. He's kind of an outcast, an outlaw. But then later, of course, it was accepted, and then we have this idea that at any stage of life, one can renounce everything if that vairagya comes. Yad ahar eva virajet, tad ahar eva pravrajet. You'll hear this quoted very often by the monks, that very day that you feel that burning desire to renounce, that very day you can just get up and leave and walk off. So they gamcha over your shoulder and say, see you later, I'm gone. Whether married or not married, children, not children. Otherwise, there are very strict rules. And Thakur, we see many times, he'll say that you really want to renounce, you have duties to your family, your children, and then if you're really qualified, have you made provision for them? Very rare cases, if that renunciation is so great, then one just takes off. This was permitted. A little bit cruel to the family left behind. But anyhow, this was kind of permitted. So we'll see when Swamiji talks about this, we have this varnashrama dharma, this different stages, and then we have this other type of distinction between the householder and the monk. Oh, swadharma. So we were talking about swadharma. We have two ideas in the Gita. One is that we have to change our nature. That if we start out in this state of bondage to our lower nature, to our desires and our old samskaras and everything, we won't be able to get out of it. We have to forcefully try to change if we're in the grip of anger and jealousy and hatred and lust and greed and pride, all of these things. We have to work on that. But Gita is very strong that there's certain sense of swabhava, certain sense of our nature, prakriti, that we can't do much about. Nigraha kim karishyati. He says, what good will self-restraint do? So from that point of view, we can say it applies to a few things. Now, we find this in the Gita basically because Sri Krishna is trying to convince Arjuna that no matter what you do, you have the heart of a warrior. You're a kshatriya. Doesn't matter how much you think, because he had that dilemma. Should I give up everything and beg my food in the street? Wouldn't that be better than killing my kinsmen? And Sri Krishna is telling him that forget about all these arguments, that your nature is going to make you fight in the long run. And there's not much you can do about it. Your nature will prevail over all of this. So a little bit of a distinction here between what is our real nature. First of all, real nature means Atman, the Swabhava. But in the Gita, it's used more in this other sense, what is my particular nature. So Sri Ramakrishna says some people, they're devotees at heart. Some are fit for the path of knowledge, some the path of devotion. This we can't change too much. And those who are born for the life of sannyasa, and those who are born for the life of the householder, we have to accept that to a certain extent. We see that those who try to renounce, and they have these, I don't want to say samskaras, but the swabhava of a sannyasin is not really strong. They struggle and they suffer. Those who really have the heart of a sannyasi and are made to marry, or they get married before this develops, they also suffer. We look at M, the compiler of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He would have loved to become sannyasi. He almost begged Sri Ramakrishna at different times to renounce, but he had a family and he had work to do and he had to support the children and everything, and Sri Ramakrishna wanted him to remain, but this is the point I'm getting at. Keep that heart of the sannyasi, grihi sannyasi, that way. So what we're talking about with the householder and the sannyasin is not really a choice. We think, in the monastic life, they very often call it a calling. It's a very interesting terminology. In Western sense also, they'll talk about joining the priesthood or something. Somebody has a calling. That means we didn't exactly decide that God called us, that it's something that just is natural, inherent, or is divine, we may say, but not exactly a decision. So when we talk about these things, we really have to examine what is our swabhava, what is deep within us. Are we fit for this life or fit for that life? And if we follow whichever one we find is meshes with our nature, that's the best for us. So each is great in its own place. That's the best for us. And if we follow the ideal of the householder and we're suited to that type of life, it can be absolutely the best type of spiritual life and spiritual practice that we can do. And the sannyasin, if sannyasin is made to marry, and it happens in India where very often the son or the daughter, they weren't given the choice. Marriages were arranged for them. We see it in the case of Purna, that Sri Ramakrishna really felt that he was born to be a monk, that no attachment to the world, no desires or anything were found in Purna, but his parents made him marry. He was young. They arranged marriages at a very young age. And he couldn't survive long. Thakur said that you make him a monk, he won't live long. And it was actually true. So we'll find that we have the swabhava, we have the duties according to the monk and the householders, and as I said before, we have some things that transcend these distinctions. So for all of us, monks or householders, that we have our duties to perform in the world, and we have to do it in a loving spirit, and we have to do it without complaining and without any ulterior motive, in an unselfish way. Everybody. The monk is not in a different category with regard to these things. Everybody always likes to say, oh, we're just householders, as if second-class citizens, as if we also don't have to do all of these things, as if we also don't have pride and attachment and all of that. These are common things to everybody. So we have these different types of teachings trying to feel that we're not the doer of action or doing everything as an offering, doing everything in the spirit of detachment. These are obligations and duties for all of us. So we have this system where either we look at it as stage by stage. We go through this householder stage of life in order to learn the lessons there. And something that I find always very interesting, that artha and kama and kamanikancha, we have these two sets of things. Artha and kama, that these are the two aims of life for the householder. That means possessions and it means enjoyments. And these are the two things that Sri Ramakrishna says are obstacles in spiritual life. Kamani means kama. It means desires. Lustful desires, any other types of desires, and kanchan gold. So it means possessions and greed. So a very brilliant idea that the householder, rather than just try to renounce these things when it's not their swabhava to do it, they get to experience them, and they get to burn their fingers a little bit and learn their lessons and fulfill desires that can be fulfilled and find out which ones are dangerous, which ones are not helpful, and then very naturally and easily they can move to the next stage. So this is the stage-by-stage theory. The other is that some have that swabhava. At the very beginning, they can renounce everything. Okay. Now, and one more thing about this earning money, that some people think that, we've become very spiritual. That means that we shouldn't try to earn more money. We shouldn't get a better job, a better place to live, this and that. Thakur says no, but within limits. And Swamiji is very strong on this. There's some very nice quotes here. He says, a householder who does not struggle to get wealth is immoral. If he is lazy and content to live an idle life, he is immoral, because upon him depend hundreds. If he get riches, hundreds of others will thereby be supported. So this, of course, means that we don't hoard things and we don't do it just for selfish. It means that we have a role to play within society. And Sri Ramakrishna, he was very strong with this idea. Those who made a lot of money by unethical means and just to become wealthy, he couldn't touch it. If they brought food, he couldn't touch it even. He had one very important disciple named Surendra, Suresh Mitra. And Thakur used to say that you earn a lot of money, and I know that it may not always be by very ethical means, and yet I can eat your food. How is that? He said, because you give away more than you take in. He was very, very generous. And then he explained this idea about giving things in charity. He gave a very beautiful illustration. He said that when the farmers, one of dozens of examples that Thakur gives about bringing water to the field, all of them with a slightly different meaning. That's also another interesting study. How many different examples he gives. This one is a curious one, because usually he says if there are holes along the way and the water gets out, then we lose it, and that this is the holes are desires and everything. It's a little bit different. He says that when they build these channels, the farmers, taking the water from the reservoir into the field, that they'll make holes in different places so that some of the water can escape. Otherwise, if the torrent comes, it'll be so strong that it'll break the walls on the sides of the channels, and the water won't get to the field. So if some of the water can get out, then most of it will get into the field and be very helpful. And the water that leaks out from the side, he says, is very rich because it's carrying that soil, and it's also good for the farmland on the side. So he said in the same way that people, if they don't give some of this money away, let the water come out through the holes, then they themselves will suffer, and other people will not be able to benefit from it. So, to get to the main point, each, whether we're householders, whether we're sannyasins, each is a great, very high ideal if we can follow that ideal. This is from Swamiji again. The life of every individual, according to the Hindu scriptures, has its peculiar duties, apart from what belongs in common to universal humanity. The Hindu begins life as a student, then he marries and becomes a householder. In old age, he retires, and lastly, he gives up the world and becomes a sannyasin. To each of these stages of life, certain duties are attached. No one of these stages is intrinsically superior to another. Householder or sannyasi. The life of the married man or woman is quite as great as that of the celibate who has devoted himself to religious work. The scavenger in the street is quite as great and glorious as the king on his throne. Take him off of his throne, make him do the work of the scavenger, and see how he fares. Take up the scavenger and see how he will rule. It is useless to say that the man who lives out of the world is a greater man than he who lives in the world. It is much more difficult to live in the world and worship God than to give it up and live in a free and easy way. Thakur used to praise the householder. They're doing everything as if they're carrying a huge load on their heads. He said if the monk calls on God, everyone would say, what's the big deal? He's got nothing else to do. He's supposed to do that. If he doesn't, then they'll say, dik. Then they'll say, shame, for shame. He's renounced everything. He's not doing any work or anything and not calling on God. But if the householder does it, he says it's a great thing. He would praise the householder that way. So this is Swamiji still speaking. It is much more difficult to live in the world and worship God than to give it up and live a free and easy life. The 4 stages of life in India have in later times been reduced to 2. This is what we're talking about now. It's an either-or thing, more than it is one following after the other. That of the householder and of the monk. The householder marries and carries on his duties as a citizen, and the duty of the other is to devote his energies wholly to religion, to preach and to worship God. So, this is the basic distinction. When we read the introduction to Shankaracharya's commentary on the Gita, he starts out with this distinction. There are 2 different paths, 2 different types of people, and he calls this nivritti marga and pravritti marga. Pravritti marga, engagement in the world. Nivritti, pulling away from the world. And he doesn't say one is better or one is worse. These are 2 things. One leads to abhyudaya, it leads to prosperity, and the other nishreyasa, it leads to the highest goal. But it's a question of swabhava. It's a question of temperament. Okay, so let's get back to our story. So this, whenever a sannyasin would come to the king would ask him that question: who is greater, the householder or the monk? And the sannyasin would give an answer one way or the other, and then the king would say, okay, demonstrate it to me. And if he couldn't do it, then the king would force him to become a householder. So this was the test, and this was the consequence of it. So one day a young sannyasin entered the kingdom and was taken to the king. The same question was asked. He said, who was greater, the monk or the householder? And he said, O king, each is equally great in his own place. So the king said, okay, that now you have to explain it to me. You have to prove it to me. It's not enough to just say that. So he said, okay. But he didn't explain it. He said, follow me. That we'll go on a little trip and see if we can find out the truth of all of this. So he agreed. So this sannyasin and the king, they started walking. They went to a kind of distant place, and there was something called a Swayamvara. Swayamvara, in the ancient days, we talk about, these forced marriages nowadays. Among these big people, these kings and the aristocrats, if they were very wealthy or had a lot of position, then the suitors would have to bid and vie for the hand of the daughter. Huh? So this beautiful young girl, princess, was there, and they were trying to arrange a marriage for her, and she was very, very picky. That all of the suitors that came, she said no. She wanted a very handsome, wonderful, intelligent person. She was very choosy about that. So there were several of them done, and they never quite found somebody that she was agreeable to. Now they saw, the king and the sannyasin saw a second sannyasin, young and handsome, and carefree, beautiful, everything. And he was just observing and watching everything, just out of curiosity. Maybe didn't know what was going on or anything like that. Meanwhile, all of the others are there. Each of the suitors, they'll have their own crier. Somebody will be there and talking about, he has his PhD from California, Berkeley, and this one, all of that, and he had a big job, and she wasn't interested. This one can sing beautifully, and she wasn't interested, but she saw that sannyasin. Now, the custom was that the one that she wanted for her husband, she had a garland, flowers. She would take the garland and put it around his neck. So that was the sign that she chose somebody. So before the sannyasin knew what was going on, she saw him, and she said, he is the one for me. So she went up very quickly and put the garland around his neck. And he said, what is happening? And she said, I've chosen you for my husband. He said, what are you mad? I am a sannyasin. How can I marry? And he threw it off. Again, she put the garland around his neck. Again, he threw it off and said, this is madness. That I have no attachment to the world. I have no interest in anything. And then he quickly went off. And there was a nearby forest, and he went deep into the forest, and the princess followed him, because now she was really smitten. I have to have him. So the sannyasin, he knew the forest, he knew the ins and outs, and he quickly disappeared. And the princess was going this way and that way and couldn't find him, and it started to get dark. So she didn't know what to do. She didn't know her way out of the forest. She simply sat down, probably some tears coming down. And this king and the first sannyasin are there observing everything. And they're watching and they're thinking, well, what can we do to help? So this is how the story starts. And make sure I don't forget anything here. Okay, so the first sannyasin and the king, they went up to the princess, and they told her that they could show her the way out of the forest, but it was too dark and they'd have to wait till the morning. So they made a little bed for them to lie down. Now, they were under a tree, and this tree had a family of birds. And the birds thought that now they're staying under our tree. That means they're atiti, they're a guest. Atiti devo bhava. One should look upon a guest as God himself or herself that's coming into my home. I have to do whatever I can for them. And they must be hungry and tired and cold and everything. And so there was a fire. Who made the fire? Did the birds make the fire? Yes. So they went and they found a little fire, and they took a little twig and everything that came, and they made a fire there. So they saw, okay, now they're warm. They feel better, but they must be hungry. So what should we do? So without realizing what was happening, the father bird flew into the fire and gave up his body, thinking that they could eat, have something, some chicken or something, some fowl to eat. And before they could think about anything, the mother bird thought, oh, my husband has given up his life for this dharma of the householder with regard to a guest. I should do the same thing. I have an obligation to do that. So he did it, and then the two little birds, the babies, they also did the same thing. So the others, before they could stop anything, they were amazed. And of course, they couldn't eat them. They felt so bad. So they passed that whole night fasting. So the next morning, the king and the first sannyasin, they took that princess and they took her back to the kingdom. And this young sannyasin was never seen again. So the sannyasin said to the king, this is the first sannyasin, "King, you have seen that each is great in his own place. If you want to live in the world, live like those birds, ready at any moment to sacrifice yourself for others." See, this householder ideal is a very high ideal. It involves this pure selflessness, living for the sake of others. "If you want to renounce the world, be like that young man to whom the most beautiful woman and a kingdom were as nothing. If you want to be a householder, hold your life a sacrifice for the welfare of others. And if you choose the life of renunciation, do not even look at beauty and money and power. Each is great in its own place, but the duty of the one is not the duty of the other." So the king was convinced, so he passed the test. Now, what do we make of all of this? This is that the theory that we choose one or the other. Now, both are good. I mean, in the old days, we find examples of people taking to sannyasa at the very end of life. The Yajnavalkya is the main example that we have, giving up his 2 wives. Not just one, he had 2 wives at the end and giving away everything. But later it's come down really now to you choose one or the other. And of course, those who choose the monastic life will be a tiny percentage. There won't be many. And of them, real sannyasis are also very few. They'll be just like real householders are very few. Most householders will fail this test of perfect selflessness. Of course, it's a very high ideal. There's another thing we have to understand about an ideal. It's something we aspire to. It's something that we realize to a certain extent. Ideal means perfection, and nobody's perfect. So we do the best that we can, but we understand that it's a work in progress. And we do our best. This is all that we can do. So these are the 2 different choices that we have based on our swabhava, based on our nature, based on our different tendencies. Now, one other point that I want to make, and then we'll stop. We can even have some questions if anybody wants. We're a small group. That Swamiji presents us with these 2 great ideals. The selfless, righteous, and pious householder, and the all-renouncing, desireless monk. And he does this, it's a very beautiful lecture. He quotes from the scriptures and everything. And as they say, it represents a very high standard for us. But Swamiji also shows that, and Thakur shows that these aren't mutually exclusive. They're not completely seal-tight categories. That the householder has to have a little bit of this renunciation. And this is a special teaching of Sri Ramakrishna. He presents us with a new ideal for the householder. That from the very beginning, the householder should go into solitude from time to time. That means the monastic instinct to go into solitude from time to time. And this is a teaching that I don't think will apply to everybody, but to his very dear, close householder disciples who were very advanced souls. He would say, after the birth of 1 or 2 children, live like brother and sister. So even these are like grihi sannyasis. This is kind of a new thing, that the householder life in the beginning can be this artha and kama. But as we grow in that householder life, it's not waiting till this vanaprastha stage of life, but even as a householder to start practicing a little bit of renunciation. And for the householder to not get too involved in the world. This trying to fill desires it has a little danger to it. That we have two things that can happen. Either we see through them and we understand they're not important and we fulfill them and they're gone, or they keep multiplying. So we have to be very cautious about that to see what direction the mind is going. But we see that for Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna, that the retired stage, vanaprastha stage, this has to be part of the householder life also. The householder is not simply doing duties, but has to also start preparing for a life fully dedicated. The Thakur says, hold on to God and the world. One hand on God, one hand on the world, until you can give up the other. And he talks about the daughter-in-law in the household, who, when she gets pregnant, her mother-in-law lessens her duties month by month by month by month. So we also, even householders, have to lessen this sense of obligation and duty and desires and everything until the birth of the child. That means God realization. And then nothing to do but play with the baby, enjoy the baby. So we have this new ideal for the monk that Swamiji has given us. Engage in the world. So it no longer is it just simply nivritti marga. The monks of the Ramakrishna Order also have to practice pravritti marga. That means that we have to be active, we have to be engaged, we have to do something. Society supports us. We have to do something for society. And this is also because this idea of swabhava, again, it's an ideal. Nobody is 100% monk or 100% householder. We all have our desires to do things, desire to accomplish things and to build something up. Some of the greatest monks of our order had that type of desire. Swamiji had that desire. It's not a selfish desire, but still a desire to do something, to be active, to build something. Swamiji used to say, You've been born in this world. You've taken on this human body. Leave a mark behind. This is one ideal. There's another ideal. They'd go through this life without leaving any trail behind. And like the birds in the sky and the fish in the water. There's no sign that they were there before. That's an old ideal. Swamiji's new ideal is do something, whether the monk or the householder. So the monks of the Ramakrishna Order, they have to be like householders in that sense, that they have some obligations and duties and some karma, some good works to perform. And the householders have to have the mindset of the sannyasi to a certain extent. They have to practice a little renunciation. They have to practice at least moderation. So if not actual renunciation. We have some wonderful examples of our sannyasins who really were immersed in the world. I think the best example is Swami Swahananda. Look at what he had to do. He lived in a household of women. Here he's a monk living in a household of women with the Holy Mother and Yogan Ma and Golap Ma and Radhu and her mad mother and had debts to look after. He was always had money problems. He had to pay for the house for Holy Mother and wanted to build something for her in Jati, and because of that he had to write that book, Lila Prasanga. And so how is he different from the householder? Family difficulties, money problems, all these things he had to do is different because his mind was different, that's all. And perfectly detached in the midst of everything, absolute detachment. But from at least an external point of view, he had to follow the ideal of the householder, doing everything in a selfless way, and doing everything as worship, and doing everything with no idea of any personal gain. So we have these beautiful ideals like that. So this idea of where the mind is, this is something very important. Many of our centers nowadays, if you go, say Institute of Culture and others, a high standard. That people will say, what is it, monks? What are they doing, living in such nice rooms and such good food and everything like that? Our order gets criticized sometimes for that. that who were these monks with umbrellas and watches on their wrists and nice shoes and things and doing all of that? So this one monk I remember, his name was Swami, what was his name? Prema Rupananda. Some of you may have seen him. He was head of Jaidambati for many, many years, long ago. He was Swami Lokeshwaranandaji's cousin. Wonderful, wonderful sadhu. So his idea was that wherever we are, because he used to visit the Institute of Culture fairly often because his cousin was there, Swami Lokeshwaranandaji, and he had to come to Calcutta for one of the things that the monks of our order do that people don't realize. They have to raise money all of the time. Maybe not so much now, but all the small centers, they would come to Calcutta. They would have a group of householder devotees that would go to them and say, we need money for this and that. They had to really do all of that. So he used to come there, and we would sit in his room with him. And I remember he had a picture of the Belur Math, the Swamiji and the others there. And we asked him why he had that, and he always carried it with him, so that even if he was in the Institute of Culture, very marble floor, very nice and everything, he would try to feel that he was living that life of extreme renunciation that the monks lived in Belur Math. So it's all a question of the mind and our understanding and our attitude. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Next Sunday, I'm going to continue this theme, but I want to talk about some of the great householder devotees who not only represented the highest ideal of the householder, but had this heart of the sannyasi. And we'll see. I'll talk a little bit about M. Mahendranath Gupta, who was, of course, the one who gave us the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. I mentioned him earlier. And some others, and also Nag Mahashai. Nag Mahashai was a householder that the monks, direct disciples even, had such reverence for him that they would try to make pranam to him even. And though a householder, he had a greater spirit of renunciation than anybody. So we see this new type of householder, new type of sannyasin both in the Ramakrishna order. And we see also that no comparison, we shouldn't compare. That and devotees should never feel that, oh, this is just for the monks, that unless we renounce everything, we can't realize God. Everything is a question of the mind and the heart. And if we have that longing for God and we have that selflessness, the householder can really practice selflessness more than the monk. We don't have anything that's really our own. How do we practice non-ownership? Those who have something, then that's the real challenge. They can really do it. So many advantages to the householder life, but as I say, we shouldn't compare one to the other. Each one is great in its own place. So a very beautiful lecture. So as I say, I'll continue, but if anybody wants to read it, you'll find it in Swamiji's Karma Yoga. And very, very inspiring. Swamiji really gave us a whole new view of everything, especially monastic life. That this wasn't just a new view, he instituted it for all of the social service work that's done in the Ramakrishna Order. This is because of Swamiji's vision. And this whole idea that Karma Yoga is not just another spiritual path, it's a way of worshiping God, seeing God dwelling in others. This, of course, he got from Sri Ramakrishna. But in any event, he really put these things into practice. This is what we know as practical Vedanta. So I see that I did use up the whole time. Anybody have any question? Then we'll close. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinas sarve santu niramaya sarve bhadrani pashyantu ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet. Om shanti 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 harihi om tat sat. May all beings be happy, may all be free from disease, may all realize the highest good, may none suffer from misery. Om peace, peace, peace be unto all.